Hello folks, my name is DC Rockwell, and this is Code and Chaos, a pseudo-random conversation that starts with tech and ends where it ends about an hour or two later. This is our co-host, Elio Greco. Tonight, we are going to continue our conversation about funeral parlor, or rather the funeral of Parler, deplatforming, and what that actually means. Before we start that, I'd like to first say that these last couple of days have been kind of weird. You know, we had this, not last couple of days really, but the last couple of weeks. So we had, this riot in D.C., and then we had an impeachment hearing and an impeachment. And I found myself just falling back into the old me, where I would just get super upset about this stuff. And I haven't been really invested in politics for a while now, actually. And my life has been so good because of it. You know, like having conversations about things that I can't affect or that I can't get involved in any serious way has really been a poor part of my life. And in the last couple of days, that snuck back in. And it's not good. It's not good for anybody. It's not good for me, and it's definitely not good for an audience to just hear me ranting about what I think and what I think and how I think it should happen. The better idea for approaching any kind of a subject like this is to really understand it and to read a lot about it and to lay out what are all of the arguments from all the different sides. And so I've had a sort of a change of heart. You know, Elio and I have done I think a fair bit of arguing for the last 2 days on our phone. And it's just been it's been some heated debate. Let's put it the nicest way we can, because he was just trying to get through to me and be like, we really need to analyze, and we need to understand the consequences of any of not just our actions, but the actions of we have to understand the consequences of the different approaches that we can take to getting to any goal in anything. And I was just really arguing about how I wanted it to go one way, and damn the consequences. And that's really how I think we can sum up my position for the last couple of days. I was upset, and I just wanted to see this one thing happen, and I really didn't want to hear about it. But thankfully, Elio has been my friend for 15 years, and he knows how to handle me. So he persisted, and he was like, no, here's some articles, here's some more articles. And of course, in classic DC style, I was like, I'm not going to read that crap. I don't ever read the manual, but I did. I then did. I sat down, I read through all of the articles, and I finally did understand a little bit more about where Elio was coming from. So the reason why I am bringing this up now, and the reason why I'm making this big admission of how foolish I've been for the last couple of days, is so this way, we can all just take a good hard look at us and say, don't be like DC. Be more like Elio. Be more like the folks out there who want to ask questions for the purpose of understanding the problem a little better. And that in these moments where we are truly actually, upset about things, and we're emotionally compromised, it's a good time to just, take a break and to learn more about the thing that we're upset about. The best way to fight fear is through understanding and learning about the problem. The more, once we understand more about what's in the dark, we fear what's in the dark a little better. A little less. So that said, let's start this conversation over. Maybe not all the way, but let's reframe it, and let's take a look at what is the real problem. And so last time we were talking about companies and how they're free to enforce their terms of service in whatever way they see fit. and that deplatforming the president and deplatforming all these folks is definitely within the bounds of applicable law. With the only exceptions being things like anti-discrimination legislation and stuff like that. These companies are within the bounds of the law to do this. But that's not the end of this conversation. The big question here is more speech always better? Because we see that we have a camp that says, no, freedom of speech should be absolute. And when we say that, we have to also ask, okay, well, what about like neo-Nazis? What about child abusers? What about spammers? What about scammers? And is free speech, not free speech, but is more speech always better? And it seems that through these, it seems that if we want technologies to help build the type of society we want to live in, then certain abusive types of behavior must be restricted. And I before I keep on quoting Martin Kleppmann, I should definitely give him the credit for all these things that I'm saying right now, because I pulled a lot of this straight from his article on decentralized content moderation. Which is all about this, which is about, well, okay, if we want technologies to help build the type of society that we want to live in, and we need to restrict certain types of behavior, then how do we moderate that? And when we were having the last conversation, I was very adamant about how I believe that we should just kick off anybody and deplatform them. It's not the same thing as censorship. It is in fact just taking away their ability to distribute their message. But I've come to realize that this is kind of short-sighted. Elio is trying to explain to me that there's some backlash that comes from this. When you do kick people off of a platform and you take away their ability to distribute their message, especially through a centralized organization like Twitter or Facebook and YouTube, then what you're doing is you're lending credibility to their original arguments in the first place. Their argument was that that big tech has too much power, that they don't want to hear what they have to say, and that it's because it's the truth. And when we kick them off of these platforms, it definitely looks like that supports. It creates the appearance that their theories about this are supported. So how do we approach content moderation in a different way? How do we restrict certain behaviors which are antithetical to the society we want to build, while also not giving too much power to things like big tech, things like Mark Zuckerberg and Jack Dorsey and all of the folks over at Google? How do we allow the community itself to participate in this debate over not just the debate? I don't think it's a debate necessary, but the process of moderating what content gets distributed to larger audiences and what content is not. And after reading a bit about this, mostly also, I think the best information I found was on Martin Kleppmann's article, though it's certainly not only limited to his article. There was a few of them, and we'll post those into the show notes. Some of these ways I'll outline now. So we have, just full on centralized content moderation, which is what we've already seen. We saw Twitter just deplatform. We see these centralized companies choosing who the winners and the losers are. And they have enormous power for doing that, leaving power in the hands of a small number of tech company CEOs or any other small and unelected group of people. It's doesn't seem like a very good long-term solution. It is providing a huge amount of power to a very few set of a very small set of people, and this can open up all kinds of issues having to do with, what happens when we have a legitimate reason to challenge that. We have to convince this small group of people. What happens when special interests can get the attention of these folks better than we can. Then from there, you also have automatic content moderation, which is taking it away from these individuals and putting it into something like just an algorithm. But these purely technical solutions they're not able to make judgments on what is fair, what is just. They're not able to make value judgments. And so it also seems to have some serious limitations. Then you have other things like filter bubbles. And these filter bubbles are, they're good for being able to make it so the content you post is only viewable by, say, your friends. It's only available. It's only able to be seen by the friends of your friends, for example. That's an example of a filter bubble. And this is good because it does give us some great tools for being able to say what I want to see and what others are able to see. But what it doesn't do is it doesn't make it so this way content doesn't exist. The content still exists out there, and it's just that certain people aren't seeing it. And in some cases, they might want the opposite sort of filter bubble where they see lots of extremist content, and this is a way that they could become radicalized. And then you have another form, which I think is real interesting, and we're going to do a deep dive into each of these, but I wanted to give a clear overview at first of what it was that we were talking about. The next one is democratic content moderation, which is that you have an elected board of moderation overseers, and they post a manifesto. I think a good example of this would be Reddit subreddits, where maybe not elected, maybe that's not part of it, but you'll have this group of moderators, and they have a manifesto about how they're going to moderate this particular board. And the idea of a democratic content moderation is sort of the same idea, except that you also have an election to elect people and have them rotate in and out of that. And then there's also the civic service model, which is real interesting because instead of there being a centralized board, basically everybody takes a stab at, not a stab, but everybody is a participant in the moderation. So for example, there's things like Stack Overflow, where in order to post on Stack Overflow, you're going to need to actually answer certain posts beforehand and build up enough points to be able to start posting yourself. Or on Reddit, you might have to earn enough karma posting in other places before they'll let you post in their community. So that said, those are the main ones that I have been able to pull out. And I'd like to just do a deep dive. I've talked enough now. Elio, where would you like to start? With centralized automatic filter bubbles, democratic civic service, or something else?
Well, I'd like to bring a few other articles to people's attention. So Popehat has some really good, and has for quite a while. There's a great article called How to Spot and Critique Censorship Tropes in the Media's Coverage of Free Speech Controversies. Recommended read. There's a lot of things that the media throws out there. Like hate speech doesn't actually have a legal definition. I'm not saying we should let everything go, but let's be clear, when we're talking about the law versus what should be law, there's a distinction there. And we talked about this a little bit in Law and Disorder. There's a legal gap that tech companies often operate within, where the law should be slow and carefully considered. We don't want law to be made on emotional knee-jerk reactions. We saw that after 9/11. We saw the Patriot Act bring in some really nasty, unconstitutional things because everyone was in this do something, anything mindset, and something, anything legislation generally goes very, very badly. So legislation needs to be slow and carefully considered, and therefore there will always be a gap. When you have a fast-moving industry, they will always be out in front of legislation, and there's, sadly, I don't know how to deal with this other than other social mores, but there will always be this gap where you can make a lot of money doing things that someday will be horrifically illegal, but aren't yet. So anyway, there's a few distinctions there. We already covered some of that, but I strongly recommend that article. You know, he covers all these, like shouting fire in a crowded theater, like not all speech is protected. The gist of this article is the freedom of speech gives you protection from the government. They cannot come after you for any arbitrary thing they dislike. There are a few. Now, it doesn't excuse you if you make active threats against someone. If you incite people to violence, you don't get a free pass because of the First Amendment. But short of these actual specific things that are illegal, everything else is, you know, and again, those things can be brought against you in court by a civilian. If you slander or libel someone, depending on written or if it's, you know, said verbally, free speech doesn't get you out of that. You could still be brought to court and you can still be fined for doing that. So that's something to keep in mind. The different domains that we're talking in, I guess discussing, I'll use that term. The decentralized content moderation article is good. There's another article on Constellis Boss. Again, we'll try to throw all these links in the description. The social media censorship issue nobody wants to talk about. And this article is fantastic. It was published on the 9th, and it is a really good, there's a lot of good links in there too. And they talk about some of the other things that we generally don't think of. And they don't cover, I don't believe, all of the issues. And that's where we have some other articles about SESTA, for instance, from Mike Masnick, who's written extensively about the ongoing fight against Section 230, which right now a lot of people are blaming the Communications Decency Act, Section 230, which basically says if you run a platform with millions or more users and they do illegal things, the executives are not held directly criminally liable, because that sounds like that'd be a great solution. The problem is, if you have more than a few people are dumb. People don't know all the laws. People do stuff that breaks the law all the time. They're just not always dragged into court. There's a game, what is it? 3 Felonies a Day. I think there's a book, and they talk about a game they used to play where you choose some really, you know, saintly figure, someone you think is actually really good. And then it's a lawyer game where you try to figure out federal crimes that you could, you know, charge them with a felony. And generally, most humans break at least 3 federal felony laws a day. So it's just that we don't haul everyone into court for everything they do wrong. So Masnick has some really good stuff on SESTA, and I remember seeing Mike Masnick speak at a conference before the SESTA-FOSTA legislation, which was a rewrite of a rewrite of a rewrite of the ongoing effort to get rid of Section 230. And one of the consequences, he said, is, look, if you get rid of this, Backpage is horrible. Backpage is not a dark web market, but it's just about as nasty. And so you have all these people selling horrible things, and there's human trafficking going on Backpage, and that's awful. But it's a source of intelligence, and it's a great way for law enforcement to actually go after the worst people who are running organized rings of human trafficking and actually find them and shut them down permanently. And there's a big difference between just average sex work and organized human trafficking. And it actually provides a little bit of safety, since in our country, in the US, sex work is not legal. You can't just go to the cops. They're going to arrest you. So you have no protection. And so Backpage actually allowed some minor degree of protection. And he argued, if you shut this down, you'll be putting all the sex workers at higher risk, because they'll be back out on the street and having to interact with clients directly, which is extremely dangerous. And not only that, all of your intelligence to find the people that are really, truly dangerous, like have, you know, commodified the crimes they're committing, you won't be able to see that anymore. They'll go on to stronger platforms that are harder to intercept. And that's exactly what happened. He published a follow-up article talking about, what I said came to pass. And if you look at the amount of human trafficking after that law did not go down. The amount of prosecutions fell off a cliff. We went from like several hundred a year to like 1 or 2. So there's some unintended consequences, and we'll put some of these articles in there. And then the final thing that just to bring up in terms of the article is there's a great article in Fast Company called Silicon Valley is building a Chinese-style social credit system. And to me, that's kind of the end game of how bad could this get. And for those not familiar, China has built we're in the early stages, but they've already deployed a massive system of facial recognition and social credit where they basically keep score. And if you want to know what this looks like, there's an episode of Black Mirror called Nosedive. Strongly recommend everyone go watch that. That's what social credit looks like. That's how horrific it can be. We don't want that. I would argue anyone who says that's a good thing, I would watch out for them. That is a dangerous person who has no grasp on consequences. And as with the rest of this stuff, the problem is the benign dictator problem we discussed last episode in part 1. If you have a benign dictator, it's amazing. Everything's great. They can make instant decisions, and a truly benign dictator is out for the good of the people. That's great. The problem is people don't last forever. So at some point, inevitably, a benign dictator will be replaced with a malevolent dictator. And then you're in a really bad spot because you have you can't get out of it at that point, short of a full violent revolution. So this is why we kind of balance things, and we have these different branches of government. The whole point of the Constitution is try to set up an adversarial balanced system where if one branch kind of gets out of control, the other two branches can rein it back in. So that's just some of the background stuff while you were talking, to fill in some of those blanks before we get into the discussion, because I think we're going to hone in on some of what Kleppmann was talking about of how do we cover the actual, mechanics of some of the moderation within that, right?
Yeah, exactly. Because I think at its core, the problem we're talking about, or we talked about a few problems, but the problem that I was wanting to focus on tonight was content moderation. And, that on every level, really, because we have content moderation in terms of just what I want to see on a social network. Like, I don't use social media specifically because the tools that I have available for moderating the content that comes to me are so poor. I don't get, for example, the ability to turn off ads. I don't get the ability to turn off political posts by people that I love because, frankly, I want to keep loving them. I found that there's certain filters that I want in place. And I don't want all of those filters to have to be put there through my own tedious work. I'm not wanting to write regex, patterns all day long to try and get ahead of what it is that I want to filter out. So there's a certain amount of it that I do want to manually create some rules. Like, for example, I would love a filter that would allow me to turn off political posts as we get closer to election cycles, for example. Maybe on the other times of the year, I might want it on. Maybe, I don't want to, be completely blocked out of all political posts, but I just want political posts that have to do with whoever the current, the current candidates are, filtered out. Maybe I want certain subjects to get filtered out for a certain amount of time to give me time to sort of cool off from it, to learn some more stuff about it, instead of having to avoid social media, which is what I used to have to do. I used to have to just say, oh man, this crazy thing just happened in the world, and I just know that Facebook's going to be toxic right now. So I'm just going to avoid Facebook, and I'll probably miss a post, about right now. I'm missing all posts because I'm just not on it. But at the time I would miss, posts that were innocent, things like my sister posting pictures of her kids and stuff like that. That's stuff I do want to see. And so content moderation on a personal level is pretty difficult. Content moderation for my acquaintances and the people in my life is difficult as well. And then there's content moderation from corporations. Which corporations do I want to hear from? There are certain companies that I want to hear what kind of new products they're putting out. What kinds of new services are coming out from certain industries and things like that. But I don't want I don't want them to do exploratory advertisement with me, being like, hey, how you feel about this golf club? You know, I don't play golf, and I don't really want to have my profile be up there saying, dude doesn't like golf, because maybe I do get into golf someday, you know, and I want some control over that. And some of these services give me a little bit of control over it. But
yeah,
anyway,
would
let's
say
start there.
That what you're talking about is important, and two key things. The terms, I think these are standard. If not, I'd like to make them so. Are algorithmic transparency and algorithmic sovereignty. So transparency is the ability to, if you're being shown something, right now it's very opaque. You have no idea when you do a search. You have no idea why the pages you're seeing are being shown to you by Facebook, Google, or any other platform. Now, well, the one thing you do know these days is because whatever you're being shown is whatever they think will make them the most revenue, which is a very different, it's not your goal. They don't care what you want to see. They're trying to keep you engaged and maximize revenue. And so the whole web has become extremely manipulative. And if we could at least see this, there are some interesting experiments with the Facebook political ad collector, and there's some new ones kind of coming out now, where you can actually install a browser, and especially during political times, if you run this in your browser, this little extension will actually collect just the ads and siphon those off to different organizations, watchdog orgs, to be able to see, kind of get this observatory and kind of reverse engineer what stuff is Facebook shoving down people's, news pipes. So I think those need to become a lot more common. I think we need to have observability. I think asking the companies to self-police is ridiculous. I think that's what we've been doing for a decade or two, and it's worked really horrifically. It's completely failed. And so asking them, there was a great timeline a few years ago in Washington Post of the cycle of Facebook doing some horrible thing and creating some horrible advertising group so people could target a hate group or just really disgusting stuff. And then they get caught, and then they delete the group temporarily and then come back later. And they'd be like, oh, we're so sorry. Yeah. Oh, yeah. We'll never do it again. And they had a timeline, and it was back then, it was up to 14. I'm sure it's probably 2030 at least now, where that's the cycle. They go on, they make a fake apology, they promise to do better, they do worse, they get caught again, they make a fake apology, promise to do better, continue to do worse. And there's just been this cycle of just spiraling into worse and worse territory. And here we are. And right now, people are finally paying attention to the US because there was violence and a few people killed. And I don't mean that to minimize, but what most people don't understand, there have been strings of murders, a lot more than 5, fomented in India from fake Facebook stuff. There have been genocides, I believe 2 genocides that Facebook helped actually start in other countries. Not 5 people dead, tons of people with the potential to wipe out an entire class of people. So this is not a new problem. This has been building. There has been a ton of evidence, but this is outside. Most Americans, we are very US centric. We don't tend to pay attention to what's going on outside the US. And so for us, this is oh, wow, who knew Facebook was so dangerous? And you have people like Zeynep Tufekci, you have people like Tristan Harris and the Center for Humane Technology for decade plus now saying, hey, this is really bad. We got to stop this before it gets really bad here too. And no one really listened. And here we are. And so that's the other thing when people say, oh, Zuckerberg's he's naive, he's young, he doesn't really understand. Okay, I could believe that if there weren't an entire chorus of dozens of people for over 15 years saying, hey, this is really bad, stop doing this, publicly and directly to him again and again and again. And again, I will lay this on Zuckerberg, because unlike many tech founders, he did manage to retain 51% of the voting shares in his company. The buck stops with the Zuck. It's his fault. He needs to take ultimate responsibility for what he's built. He cannot pass that off on anyone else. Sure, there's probably people in Facebook that are complicit, but ultimately, if he wants to turn the ship, he's the one at the steering wheel even today. So this is why I cut him no slack on this whatsoever.
So you're going to hate me for saying this, but I kind of empathize a little bit with Zuckerberg after learning the scope of this problem. So hold
okay,
on.
go on.
Let me explain what I mean by this. So after looking at what it takes to do content moderation, and keep in mind, I'm not empathizing with everything Mark Zuckerberg has to go through. Okay. Just on this one problem, which is that if what we want is for Facebook to moderate content which is hateful, which is potentially inciting violence, if it's content which could cause, like you said, a genocide, it's very difficult to find this content, and it's very difficult to moderate it effectively. So Facebook has 15,000 content moderators working, I'm presuming shifts. So at any given time, there's probably some subset of that's, watching their screens and trying to find this content. But there's some serious questions about identifying this stuff. What is somebody expressing healthy skepticism versus a harmful conspiracy theory?
Yeah. And let's come back to that, because I think, like you said, Kleppmann has some interesting points in his article, but I do want to reiterate, even though we covered this pretty extensively in the last part one of this, I think now we have to talk about moderation. But I think going back to, this is Zuckerberg's fault, and he's not the only one. Google has, to a lesser extent, had similar issues, but Facebook is by far the worst on this, but not the only tech company that's been steering us in the wrong direction. Is we created this problem. There's some great write-ups in the New York Times, some opinion pieces about, I can't remember if it's the same article. I was trying to double check while you were talking, but there's one called, they used to post selfies, now they're trying to reverse the election. I can't remember if that was the article. I believe it was. And they were talking about how people initially were just sharing benign stuff, and they were just sharing pictures of, like you said, happenings and what did the kids do. And and I've benefited from that. Back when I used to use Facebook, I'd have friends and they'd post something that the kids do. I'm like, oh, that's great. And you'd see the picture, like, that's really cool. I'm glad I saw that. And if we had to actually like put an email together straight to a certain person, like, I will say, I hope someday we have a de-Facebook social media. We have a way of putting out just kind of a broadcast of, hey, I did this thing, not to everyone, not to the whole world, just to people you know and care about, and just kind of posting, hey, I did this thing. Hey, my family, my kids did this thing, relatives did it. That's really cool. That's something really nice about that. And it's not as onerous as trying to like maintain an email list. It's lighter than that. And that could be a good thing. Where that went really sideways is when you start combining that with the need to make revenue by showing ads. And so what happened is, and this article chronicled it well, you had someone on there, this guy who, was alt-right, or excuse me, was just benign and kind of moved alt-right because he posted, I forget what the first thing was. It was relatively benign, but it was vaguely political, and he got a whole bunch more likes and a whole bunch more exposure. And you get a little dopamine hit. And you're like, oh, okay, well, what do let's see, let's post this. And you post something a little more extreme, and you got even more exposure. And this guy went from posting just basic pictures and basic updates that got, a dozen, 2 dozen, likes from people, to incendiary political stuff, which was getting him hundreds and then thousands of likes and followers, to the point that he actually showed up at the riots, at the little sedition event there. And the only thing that may have saved him is his phone was running low on batteries, and before it really got bad, he left. He went back to the hotel to charge the phone. So we'll see if he gets charged or not. But he was not one of these people who's like out to really overthrow the government. He got caught up in that easy addictive cycle of those dopamine hits of publishing a heavily liked post. And Facebook's algorithm, because you have no control, there is no sovereignty, you can't adjust the algorithm, and you don't know what it's doing. You can't see what it's up to because you have no algorithmic sovereignty. It steered a whole bunch of people into a really bad place, because it turns out love and fluffy posts get engagement a teeny bit, but the dark posts that incite hatred, those get a lot more engagement. And we talked about that last time. Getting people pissed gets them a lot more engaged and riled up and gets them on the site, hate tweeting and hate posting. And that keeps them there a lot longer. You can show them a lot more ads. And there's another Times article right now that this article is not Times. This is BuzzFeed. Facebook has been showing military gear ads next to insurrection posts. Again, the algorithm is optimized, whatever makes the money. There's no human decision. There's no, is this a good idea? Is this a bad idea? I'm not cutting them slack because they have been warned for almost 2 decades about these problems by dozens of people. There is no excuse for Facebook not to understand the gravity of the situation. Again, 2 genocides, multiple murders in other countries. It's not coming out of nowhere. Anyone who thinks this has just suddenly became a problem overnight in the last 2 weeks, no, this has been a major global problem for, I would say, like in a really dangerous way, at least the last 5 years, if not the last decade. It's been simmering before that, but we've known for almost a decade how dangerous this was. It just hadn't made it all the way over here. So anyway, we'll stop there. We'll get to the moderation stuff. But the last point, like I said, algorithmic transparency is something we should be demanding. You need to know how you're being manipulated. You need to be able to see what levers, what dials are being twisted. And ideally, if you really want the internet to be useful and not toxic, you need to have ways of tuning the algorithm for yourself. And this idea goes back to the original PDA, the personal digital assistant. I'm not talking Palm Pilots. I'm not talking, what actually hit the market. I'm talking like back in the 80s and 90s. I remember reading computer science papers and like little, even pop science articles talking about someday you'll have this little computer that it'll be smart enough to like figure stuff out and know like what restaurants you like and when you'd like to have lunch and who your friends are. And you won't have to schedule anything. Your little computer running software locally on your behalf will just reach out and be like, hey, you got 3 friends around you that all like food. They're all hungry right now. And just automatically, I went ahead and scheduled you lunch at a restaurant you guys are all going to like. That's the science we could have if you're in control of the system. But instead, when we're in an ad-centric model and it's not about the user is the product that's being bought and sold. Actually, it's their attention and the ability to manipulate them. That technically is what's being bought and sold to the advertisers. And that goes to really bad places, as we're seeing and have seen. And that's what we need to ditch. There's no way to fix Facebook or any social media platform. If your model is based on selling manipulation of users, it will always be broken. It will always go to these horrific places. I don't care how many more of these you start, what you call them, what technologies you use to build this model. This model is deadly. It is a poison, and we've got to move away from it as quickly as possible.
I agree. So, I mean, this explains the reason why our filter sovereignty, our moderation sovereignty, is it's just not as capable as we would like it to be, and it also explains why some questionable content makes it to us in the first place. So, sovereignty is really about talking about that last filter. It's the final filter before it gets to you. It was already broadcasted out to all the people, and if in a fully featured system, it would allow me to create a filter that says, yes, it was sent out to everybody, but I don't want to see it. But we still have the problem of this information still being sent out to everybody in the first place. And the reason why we have news reports about a riot right next to an ad trying to sell people paramilitary gear is because there's a financial incentive there that Facebook and other companies find irresistible. They're taking the deal, right? And the reason
been
why
profitable.
Yeah,
it's been incredibly profitable.
It has been. And they want it to continue being profitable, which is why A, they're going to allow that information to get broadcasted, and B, they're going to prevent you from having the tools needed to not see it. So, that said, that explains why things are the way they are right now. I think, I don't know if there's a lot more to talk about there. This just hits the nail on the head.
Well,
is that
there's one more thing worth mentioning, and there's been several articles about this. The worst thing about all this, you know how we were sold this idea in the first place? Oh, it's going to learn your preferences, and you'll see only the ads that are actually useful to you that you'll care about. There have been at least 2 or 3 good articles in the last 3 years or last 2 years. And I'll just read the headline off this one. Facebook's ad targeting is inaccurate. It doesn't work. And there have been several others. Like, it doesn't even work. So we've made this deal. They've made a huge amount of money off it. The public has seen no benefit from this and extreme cost. That's the worst thing about this.
Yeah. And, I think it's worse than inaccurate. In some ways, it's malicious. So, for example, I made a decision, about a year ago to give up alcohol and just to be completely sober. I decided it wasn't serving me in my life. And I did a couple of Google searches on what it would take to stay sober, and what kinds of challenges might I face, trying to go from being a person who casually drank all the time to a person that wanted to be sober. And I immediately started getting liquor ads. Immediately. And it's like, I started thinking about it, and I'm going, there's a lot of people out there whose life depends on being sober. And these algorithms give that information of a person who wants to turn their life around over to the exact companies that got them into that kind of trouble in the first place, so that way they could reel them back in as a customer. And I found that to be malicious, that these companies, I never got a liquor ad until I decided to stop drinking liquor. You see what I'm saying?
Well, and whether that's intentionally malicious or not, I mean, this is the problem with AI, which is really machine learning. It just finds patterns. And so if the pattern it finds, which is likely to find, is people who are in AA tend to buy alcohol when they slip up or they give up on it and go back to drinking, the pattern's not wrong. It's a damaging, dangerous thing, but that's what the AI is going to find. And it's going to be like, hey, these people will buy alcohol. Show these people alcohol. Because it's stupid. It's just finding patterns, and then it's not using any human judgment.
Right. And I presume that this is something that there's lots of, for example, if I were to start, I guess I have been searching for a long time how to lose weight and different kinds of diets and stuff like that. Is this the reason why I get so many ads about pizza? Does the normal person, does a thin person get as many, ads about food as I do? But I guess that's the point. Is just that we don't have sovereignty over the kind of content which is sent to us. And you're saying, a third consideration here is that companies like Facebook will lie to us, or at least intentionally mislead us into accepting terms of service. So basically, a government says, hey, you can't actually show this to people without them opting into it. And they get you to opt into it, saying, oh, well, we're going to give you more control over the content that you are going to be shown if you just give us your consent to show it to you in the first place. So it's pretty awful, the state that we're in. So since we don't have a lot of time, I do want to kind of move on to the next two parts of this. So the first is about content moderation and the types of content moderation. Basically, how do we if we could solve this? If we could, say, build our own social network, and we still have this need to moderate content on it, how what is the best way of being able to moderate content on it without there being some yet more undesirable effects from, for example, filter bubbling and things like that?
So let's make a distinction here, and we may run out of time. It looks like we will. Right now, we have a mess, and we talked about that last time. We jumped off the cliff. We had options. We could walk in several directions. We decided to jump right over the edge. So we're in a free fall right now. We have to deal with that. There's probably not a good solution. Whatever we do is going to be a terrible thing. It's going to have costs one way or the other, but we're stuck with that. So there's the, where are we now? How do we clean up this horrible mess we're in? How do we kind of, try to go toward the water and not hit the rocks at the bottom of the cliff? Which is going to be painful either way. But maybe we'll survive it. And then there's a second question of, if we were going to completely start over and the internet accidentally got popular, it was never designed to go out to the world. A lot of the protocols we have right now have no security built in. We bolted on state so people could log in and have web apps with stuff like cookies, which created a ton of problems. I'm going to discuss those in a separate talk that I may give at a local security group and an article. I think we'll cover some of that. So I'm not going to talk about them here, but I think we could have avoided the entire moderation mess to begin with, but right now we didn't, and we have to deal with it. So let's use the time we have to talk about how might we.
Yes, and I kind of want to form a distinction. Maybe you know of a good way of classifying this, but in the beginning of this conversation, we were talking about content which society, if we want to build society a certain way, and we want it to be this thing which people can grow in and get healthy in and realize their dreams, that there's certain kinds of information, or not information, but certain kinds of content which we would want to restrict. So maybe we'll just call that restricted content, right?
Okay.
And yet we're also talking about things which wouldn't necessarily be restricted content. And those are things like ads. Those are things like, people posting their political opinions, things like that. There's non-restricted content, which we still want the ability to, we still want our sovereignty in being able to filter this stuff. We still want the ability to control what we're going to see. But then we also have restricted content and how to deal with that as well. So which of those two do you want to first try to tackle?
Let's talk about how do we clean up some of the mess. We've split reality, and people now have at least two different realities that they see. And so, right now, even though I am very, very pro First Amendment, extremely pro, like, there's got to be a darn good reason to not go with the First Amendment and let people say what they want. But when we start having actual violence, that's pretty good reason to start taking some measures. So, and because people are just unable to pull themselves out of this spiral, and because we're not getting rid of Facebook and some of these, we got to deal with this somehow. So how do we minimize the negative impacts, which are inevitable, but how do we clean up some of this mess, I think is worth talking about.
This is where, we always talk about how there's parts of libertarianism that we really like. And this is one of those pieces that I do really like, is that libertarians have this saying, which is, how do we solve this problem with more freedom?
Yeah.
And I kind of like that in this case. How do we solve this problem of content moderation by giving people more freedom as opposed to taking away their freedoms, taking away their right to free speech, for example? So one of these solutions, which is the either, and I think democratic content moderation doesn't really fall under that belt, because we're still giving up we're delegating our power over to some central, committee that's going to hopefully do what they say in some sort of manifesto, and it's still not individual freedom in that sense. But the civic service model, I think, is really interesting. And I would love to hear some of your reservations about this, because I know you have some,
Yeah.
which is the civic service model seems very interesting. First, let's talk about the non-restricted content. Okay, non-restricted content meaning, you know, we're not talking about hate speech. We're not talking about people calling for violence.
Mm-hmm.
We're not, you know, we're talking about non-restricted content.
Yeah.
In this case, it seems interesting to allow each individual to have the freedom of moderating another piece of content in order to basically earn a point for posting their own content. In other words, a part of being part of the community means that you need to take on a certain amount of civic service. And that civic service, we have real versions of this. You know, we have versions of this off the web, like jury duty, for example, right?
Yeah,
in
just
order
like
to
moderating society, essentially.
It is. It really is. And this is the best system we've come up with so far on being able to moderate society and restricted, basically making a judgment call as to, for example, libel or slander or something like that, or different kinds of criminal cases. And so I guess libel and slander, I'm not sure. I guess that is a criminal case.
Stuff that's jury trial. But anyway, go on.
But anyway, the point is that if we could allow folks to, you're currently allowed to say what you want to say on the internet. But what if you were allowed to say what you want to say and you were able to have a vote for all the other pieces of content, kind of like how Reddit allows you to upvote and downvote things, right? And you're able to vote certain kinds of content as acceptable or not acceptable for the, distribution to the wider community.
Yeah.
So, to me, that seems like fighting this problem with more freedom.
Yeah. So there's at least 3 issues I see with that. One is the 99-1 principle, or the 1% rule. This is from a thing called Hacker Laws. It's a repository of these little sayings that we throw out, and it suggests that within an internet community such as a wiki, 90% of participants only consume content, 9% edit or modify, and 1% add. So one issue there is, how do we get people to actually engage? Now, I'm not sure they don't talk about liking content, which I think would be closer to moderation. So there's that issue. The other issue I have is there's an issue of bias. How do you take smaller marginalized groups, even if you are mixing this and like randomly showing content to people and they've agreed to do this and they're actually stepping up and doing the work? If it's an unpopular idea, how do you actually, if it's not, because there's some ideas that socially have been very unpopular and that those views are changing, and now we're like, oh no, that's okay. We don't want to censor that group. So how do you make sure that doesn't get just put down by society, not even in a malicious coordinated way, just in this is a niche mindset that's not illegal, that actually may have legal protection at some point. But right now, statistically, if you throw this piece of content in front of some random person, they're probably going to vote it down.
Okay. I mean, it's a good point. It's a good point, because I didn't know about the 99-1 rule there. That definitely creates a major problem with the civic service model. So, in that case, we don't have democratic content moderation, which would be a board that we elect, is undesirable. Civic service model would be then also undesirable because of the bias that's involved there. The filter bubble model, let's talk about that a little bit deeper, which is that we get to create our own bubbles of filters. So, for example, there are certain kinds of systems that allow you to create your own servers, and then you get to create your own terms of service on these servers. You get to create your own filters for this. If you don't like the filters that are on this, you can create your own server, right?
And this, so contemporary, so kind of 3 examples. Newsnet, back in the day, Newsnet, there was this whole massive hierarchy of categories, and each server could decide which parts, which subsections, subtrees of the hierarchy they would decide to mirror. And some would mirror all of it, and some would mirror only specific subtrees. Reddit and stuff like that, and Dig and all those have been doing this too. And then a more contemporary, fully decentralized, going back toward the Usenet early days, is Mastodon. And same thing, you can set up, although the problem we're seeing with Mastodon is that certain instances, I think 10% of the Mastodon instances are hosting, I think it's like 50 to 80% of the traffic. So ideally, anyone can set it up, but in reality, it kind of does tend to centralize. You get really popular servers. So that becomes kind of the dominant, like, yeah, in theory, anyone can go set up a Mastodon node and host whatever they want. But in reality, you still get some centralization that just naturally occurs because of popularity and network effects.
Yeah, and the same sort of problem happens on Diaspora. The same sort of problem happens on all of these kinds of servers. It just seems that the way humans interact with these kinds of systems trends towards centralization again. And so you have,
So I think that the one thing worth mentioning, because you said we're quickly running out of time, but you're not talking about the banned material.
Run over. I don't care today.
Okay. I didn't know if you had a hard stop tonight.
Nope. It's a Thursday. We're good.
Okay. So
I think it's a Thursday. Yeah. I double checked.
Who knows these days? Time is weird. Days feel like weeks or months. So in that case, one of the things we talk about more objectionable material, because this is something that I've thought deeply about for a number of reasons. I've been doing decentralized systems research for 2 decades, a little over, since Publius. That was, I think, the first awesome, like, potentially like censorship resistant network. I remember reading about that in like Scientific American or something like that. I remember in the military, in I think basic training, I was reading about Publius, and I'm like, oh wow, this is really cool. And then what happened, which is what usually happens with these, is, and I don't mean to minimize this is a real problem, but if you're doing any kind of communications research that involves any level of censorship resistance, immediately you get hit with, what about child porn? What about child sexual abuse material? We use the proper term CSAM. And so I've been paying attention to that, partly because of that research, partly because of reading stuff about Bruce Schneier and risk analysis when kids are involved. And then I've been consulting for the last 4 years on a project to actively try to prevent harm for kids. And I came in real skeptical and I'm getting a little more involved, and they might have some funding, but I'm still I'm always the one what about this use case? What about this? How do you protect the kids? Because one of the things that I think a lot of these services because I'm starting to do some market research now on these services that you install on your kid's phone, and they try to protect them from objectionable content, which is really hard to do for a number of reasons. I guess, screw it. Let's talk a little bit about that. For instance, if you want to make the problem really, really narrow, because ML does good in a very narrow circumstances. So let's say you want to confine the problem to preventing a picture of a penis from showing up on the screen. Seems real simple, right? Seems like, oh, okay, we could do this, right? Okay, except that is really fraught, because when we say a picture of a penis, what do we mean? Do we mean a photograph? I mean, obviously a pornographic photograph, obviously, right? That's easy to say, yeah, we don't want to show that to underage kids. However, what if it's a picture of the statue of David? Still a picture of a penis, still reasonably accurate. Some parents are going to be like, no, I don't want my kid to be deprived of great art. Show him the statue, show her the statue, whatever angle. It's great art. If they want to study great art, I have no objection. There's plenty of paintings, so there's nudity involved. And then it gets even more difficult when you start talking about much more rough depictions. And there's all kinds of on YouTube, there's a whole category of news bloopers. And in front of the green screen, she's drawing out the news weather man, weather woman. Right, I've seen multiples on this. They're drawing out the storm track, and it's like, whoops, that looks like a very crude drawing of a penis on the screen. They're like, oh, So does that count? And I can see that being argued both ways, because now there's a lot of stuff. If you go that crude, where just a line and then 2 circles in the bottom is a penis, There's a lot of stuff that happens to look like that.
And
There's a lot of phallic images. And so in most cases, that would be crazy to censor it. However, to make it even more complicated, there could be a joke. There could be bullying. There could be a kid in a locker room context that they've made a joke about his penis for whatever reason. And that's actually harassment. That's actually doing severe psychological harm. And they're just piling on. And that's the harassment, is just drawing this little symbol everywhere they can possibly put it to bring that joke back up, in which case normally this little symbol would be totally inoffensive and harmless and just kind of, that's funny, right? For a second, that's it. Could actually be something that's much more insidious. So there's all these little use cases and corner cases that make something even as ostensibly simple as preventing pictures of penises from showing up on the screen into a really fraught decision, where even assuming you had a perfect AI, this mythical AI that never messes up, there's real world contextual issues that make censoring content really fraught.
This is why I find it a little bit, I don't want to call it funny, but I find it odd that we can't figure out how to make computers drive a car automatically.
Of course not.
And yet we're already asking the question of, how can I have this computer raise my kid? Yeah. And to me, the raising of the kid is just such a far more complicated problem. And, how do I moderate what my kid's going to see, what my kid's going to be exposed to, things like that. Folks want to give their kid a device that's connected to the internet, that has a screen on it that you can show images and videos. It can play audio. It can take pictures of them, and yet they don't want to sit there with them, the whole time while they're using it. They want something else to do that.
I was going to say, it may not even be a matter of want. We've got everyone so busy running around doing all kinds of tasks that it's impossible. So as much as I personally am against, for the most part, this stuff, I also recognize that it kind of, in a way, we've sadly backed ourselves into a corner where it is not reasonable to say a parent can constantly look over a kid's shoulder. Like, I remember just even 10, 15 years ago, it was pretty reasonable to say, look, there's a shared computer. Everyone didn't have a little pocket computer. And so, just put the computer in the family area, right? A lot of problems get solved by just putting the computer. Don't let the kid have the computer in their room. Just put it in the family area. And it's a lot harder to sneak around and do dangerous stuff if everyone, mom and dad and anyone else who's in the room, you'll self-censor generally by, you're not going to go to sketchy sites when mom or dad are right over there. That's a pretty dangerous proposition. But that's not the world we live in anymore. A lot of people are buying kids cell phones when they're like 7 and 8, and they're growing up with the device. And this is where I didn't really understand this. And I forget who explained to me like why. There's a good article, I think it was, that I first kind of got on the radar. And then I was talking to someone else about cyberbullying, and you're like, it's cyberbullying. Like, yeah, I remember like sending back and forth pictures, messing with each other in high school, and you'd screw with someone and they'd send you a picture back, and whatever, man, it's the computer. It's not the real world. Who cares? No one's going to like actually beat you up on the computer. And I think a lot of people that are our age or older, we grew up without the internet being all like ever present and omnipresent. And so we grew up with this idea of this demarcation between the real world and the computer world. And the computer world's a stupid little toy, whatever, who cares, right? Doesn't matter. But the problem is a lot of digital natives, which I'm, using a term that even, a lot of people have kind of backed away, because usually they bring that up when kids know how to use computing. They grew up with them. They know how to swipe and tap. They don't know how to actually make it do what they, they don't know how to make the tech work for them. They've been brought up where you work for the tech. You are the product that Facebook sells, as we covered already. So it is ever present. And a lot of parents, because the schedules are so hectic, I've seen plenty of parents just hand their expensive phone to the kid. In some cases, we're talking below 3 years of age, as like a digital pacifier. Like, I'm busy right now. Here, just, I got to do this. I got to talk to this other person. Just take this and stay entertained. And so kids have grown up with this, just it's there all the time. And this is where digital, like cyberbullying, gets really nasty and pernicious, is that if you are going to sleep if the device is with you all the time and there is no one looking over your shoulder, and there's this just torrent of abuse coming in 24/7, at least getting beat up at school, you're not at school all the time. You're not even at school most of the time. You go home and you have a respite. You're not constantly being, unless the bully lives next door, then maybe you have a bigger problem. But for the most part, you get a break and you only have to deal with that sometimes. And cyberbullying is constant. It's so easy to keep messing with people and so easy for the adults to write it off as not real. Oh, just ignore it. And I don't think there's a wide recognition that the digital half of someone's life now is at least as important to younger people and increasingly to professionals as well. You have a reputation to maintain on LinkedIn and all this, and anyone who's saying, it's, I ignore it. There are people getting fired for what they're posting. If you lose your job without any kind of social safety net in the society we have, that can be damn near life ending. So it's not the digital world. You can't just brush it off and ignore it and say it doesn't matter anymore.
True. But for example, there's nothing that I did in my life before 18 that I think any potential employer is going to have a legitimate reason to be interested in. And so is there any good reason for somebody who is under 18 to have a social media presence, to have the ability to share things and stuff like that, other than to train them for when they become 18?
Well, there's a lot of kids that think that that's a viable, they don't know the numbers. And just like a lot of adults, we have this image of just boundless opportunity and, oh yeah, you just do this and you get rich and you don't worry about anything, which happens to a very, very small percent of the population. Indeed, it can happen theoretically. But when you look at, it's like going pro in sports, the percentage of people that actually make it pro and actually not just kind of make a living, because I had actually a relative who was basically good enough to be pro baseball, and he was on the track, and he's like, I make less money than a teacher, and teachers are drastically underpaid. He's like, I'm like almost starving here, and I'm on a team on a track to go major leagues, but right now I can barely pay the bills. And he actually decided to give up and just start coaching kids. He was making way more money coaching kids that were still living that dream than actually on the track to try to become a pro baseball player. So the same thing with these kids that, I forget the kid's name. What's the little kid that does the unboxing videos? Makes like $3 or $4 million a year.
Right. Yeah.
Like, he does. He's one out of, millions that want that.
That channel is terrifying, by the way. Just if you've ever gone on it, You just know that this, I don't know it, but I really worry about that kid's future. You see all these child stars, and you see the kinds of trouble that they get in later in their life, and I really worry about that kid. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. I think what's interesting about this is, I think that this basically lays out an argument that automatic content moderation of any kind is really going to be highly flawed. It's going to be something that cannot be counted on. So, and we didn't even talk about how, you're talking about actual pictures of penises. You're talking about drawings of penises. What about the dog bagel problem? And what about things that are flagged as a penis that have nothing to do with a penis? What about an orange and a banana?
Yeah, right. Or again, 2 oranges and a banana or something like that. Like I have seen, like, it really is patterns, and a lot of this stuff we really don't understand. There's actually brand new. I just saw one today called Facet. There's Lime. Lime was the first one to try to figure out and peek inside machine learning algorithm and be like, what is going on in here? And Lime is kind of a brute force approach. And then there's Echo, I think, was for language models that just came out a week or two ago, ECCO. And then Facet, which I haven't had time to review. I just found it earlier today, and plenty of other stuff going on pre-show. So we're in the very early days, and it was only not even 5 years ago, the Federal Budget Office put out a request for XAI, or explainable AI, being able to look into the model and be like, what is going on here? So you think that's a face. Why do you think that's a face? Or like the example we gave, I think we talked about self-driving cars. We talked about the little modifications on the stop sign, putting some stickers on there. And it's like, oh, 45 mile an hour. It's like, actually, that's a stop sign. Why did you think it's big, it's red, it's octagonal? How did you screw that up and think that was a speed limit sign? Because we just can't interrogate an AI. We have no idea what's going on. All we can do is throw more data at it and hope it corrects itself and hope it doesn't fall into catastrophic interference and get a lot worse all of a sudden, which happens.
Right.
So yeah, I think trying to throw AI at the problem, which Facebook has tried to do, you're going to get some results. There was a great survey last year of the existing, because there already are models. Google has one, and there's at least a dozen. And again, this went under, I hadn't been really kind of officially on the team, but I sent this to this company I'm advising. And I'm like, look, here's your competitors, and here's their accuracy and efficacy. And they had this whole sample data set of different pornographic images, some that were really mild, some that were not actually pornographic, but like a woman in a small swimsuit. Like, well, what do you do? Again, like, should it flag that or not? And it's interesting seeing the different approaches and seeing the different efficacy rates and what got flagged and what didn't. And one approach, the old saying, a broken clock is right twice a day, right? So one approach that Google takes is, because they're selling this as a way of keeping kids safe, so just block everything. Just be rabid about blocking anything and everything. It might even kind of be just censor the hell out of the web. And so one of the interesting things that they block, if you send any kind of line art drawing, blocked. It doesn't even bother to look at what is going on in the drawing, because there's hentai, there's pornographic anime. So we're just blocking all of it. If it even looks like it might kind of be anime, just blocked. And so their model is very effective at stopping offensive material. But the problem is the Google program, I haven't seen a re-review of it, then false positive rate is through the friggin' roof. It'll block a whole bunch of stuff it shouldn't be blocking. And I ran into this back in the day with, I think it was XProtect when I was in high school. And I think I've mentioned it on the channel before, but I had to look up a geology project. I typed in crystal, boom, big scary error message. Oh, are you searching for crystal meth? No, I'm searching for how crystals form in the earth for the report. Please let me do my search. And of course, it was just there was no AI really popular back then. It was just keywords based. So crystal anything, crystal Pepsi, crystals in a geode, anything that had the word crystal, just straight up blocked. I had to do all the research for that at home because I could not get to the data I needed to do my schoolwork thanks to this stupid system. So that I've been personally negatively impacted by crappy systems that are trying to protect kids. So yeah, I've done a ton of thinking about this for well over 2 decades. And also how to bypass it back then. So
it seems like whether you're taking a blacklist approach or a whitelist approach, there's significant cons to both. So in the case of, if you, for example, let's talk about like maybe because if you were using a computer network at a college, and you take a whitelist approach to that, very little, it's not going to be a very useful resource, right? There's only going to be certain things that you can go to, and
especially in a college setting. Yeah.
Right, exactly. But if you take the blacklist approach, then, words like crystal could be blocked, all kinds of things. And what if what your class is that you're actually trying to write a paper about how to help with things like CSAM, and you're trying to actually look that stuff up for research purposes. Well, let's not even. That has some interesting moral and legal issues. So let's stay away from that. But let's talk about the current stuff. If you're trying to do, for instance, one funny thing I heard, I'm like, this is awesome, so good. Someone's like, yeah, I started. I think I saw this. I think it was LinkedIn, and someone's like, yeah, I saw. I'm on Bumble, which is a dating app. And she's like, yeah, I just started accepting all these, swiping right or whatever on all these alt-right looking guys. And she's like, it's awesome. They're sending me all these videos to prove they were there. They were protesting. And she's like, I just forwarded them to the FBI. So, wow. That's brutal.
So that stuff, like in that case, she's acting as a honeypot. But in terms of doing research and actually going after, like, if you block all offensive speech to everyone, you've now, like you said, you've taken away the ability to do research. You've taken away the ability to study the problem and say, well, wait a minute, what's going on? What's driving this? And if you make it impossible to talk about or to study the problem, there's no way you're going to find a solution except by pure accident or luck. So 100% automatic filtering is really dangerous.
Yeah, and it just seems like no matter which way we go with that, if we're blocking everything and only allowing certain things through, then we have this problem of not having access to the things we do need. If I need to if I'm trying to write a paper on racial violence, and that's not, then I can't get access to the materials I need for that. And if you take a blacklist approach, then you're going to have the opposite problem where it's like you have to allow certain things that you really don't want on your network to come in because it's just we don't have a machine learning algorithm that can flag this stuff properly. And then even if you do use a machine learning algorithm to flag things, you see all of these false positives, all these contextually appropriate content being flagged erroneously.
Yeah. And in a research example that you brought up, well, maybe you do get to some stuff that's been whitelisted and it's been marked okay for research. But if you're doing a PhD or even just, lower level research and you're trying to find new insights, if all you can look at is secondary materials and a subset, how could you ever actually do real research and find new insight if you can only look at this restricted subset that everyone's already combed through everything? Like, it causes real problems.
Yeah. So then it seems to me that whatever the solution is, it really has to go through a human filter. And it can't just go through one human filter because, like you were saying, there's cultural differences on what can be considered acceptable or not. One person's going to look at the statue of David and they're going to see pornography while another person looks at it and sees fine art. So how do we solve that problem? First off, how do you even solve that problem on a small scale? And then how do you scale that up to an entire internet that needs content moderation? Or is it that we're just we're basically taking this journey through these different forms of content moderation to arrive at the conclusion that we can't do anything about it, that this is in fact an unsolvable problem?
I think part of the thing that we've fallen into, technology moves fast, and we just assume there's this ethos that, move fast and break things, and we did. Whoops. I think there's actually a role to be played by slowing things down. There is a damping effect that is actually protective that we've ignored. So let's briefly look at cryptocurrency. If you look at regular banks, if people do a run on the bank, what is it? It's a Wonderful Life, I think. There's a scene. So if everyone's got to rush to the bank and they're like, oh, I'm taking all my money out. The economy's going to collapse, whatever. There is a limit to how many hours the bank is open, how many tellers are at each window, how long withdrawing your money takes. So if something spooks everyone and they want to just make a run on the bank, they're not going to all pull their money out immediately. It's going to take a few days, more than likely, at least a week or two, for all the consumers to pull, depending on the size of the bank and various factors. It's going to take some time. Now, with Ethereum, we saw an instantaneous crash of the market all the way to zero because a lot of people had set up automatic bots and things. That's the whole point, is you can have smart contracts and you can program them to do things when certain things happen. If it gets down to this, sell. If it gets, up to this, buy, or vice versa, however you want to, program it. And the problem is, we've seen that in the stock market too. They're called flash crashes. And when you start having too much automation where one condition will trigger a thing, that can cause another condition that'll trigger another thing, and you get cascading failures, and entire markets can just drop like a rock, and maybe they bounce back up, maybe they don't. And so having people in the mix to bring some sanity and reason and slow the process down is actually protective. And so I think what we're trying to do right now is we're trying to pull in these automated solutions to fix the problem quickly. And I honestly, every time I think of how would we do this, and I like some of the examples that Kleppmann talked about in terms of how do we do, like jury duty. That's an interesting concept, saying we could have everyone take a role policing. One of the things we didn't even talk about yet is the toll on Facebook moderators. You can't stare at CSAM and murders and beheadings and stuff all day. Most moderators burn out in under 2 years. And most of them are left with PTSD, because when 9 to 5, you're looking at the worst possible things humanity has to offer, you don't last long doing that.
Well, plus, I mean, I would imagine that Facebook has worked out in some sort of way that there's legal immunity to the temporary holding of that material for the moderators to see it. And that how would you even extend that out if that were to go to everybody?
Right. So there's the legal issue of, if you're having people moderate, you're now spreading objectionable things further, which could have unintended consequences, and you could actually radicalize people that never would have seen it. The bigger issue I just
mean, like, if somebody sees, if they have an illegal video sent to them for moderation, and isn't that possession, and isn't that illegal? And how do you give a temporary, so
you'd have to amend the law, but even if that's okay, even taking the law out of it, what if the video is really traumatic for them? What if it's like horrific abuse? Like, now the whole point of having moderators, and I hate to say this, but this is really what's going on. When you have a little moderator staff, you're sacrificing those people and their mental health to protect the greater public. So if you're now having all the public engage in moderation, everyone's being sacrificed supposedly for everyone's benefit, and that doesn't really work.
So I got a really messed up question. Okay, so I know this is super not PC. Okay, but I've heard of certain people who are neuroatypical, who are highly resistant to that kind of trauma. What about giving them a job? And I know that sounds weird, but like,
I would want to run that by, obviously, first, a psychologist might be able to point out some things, be like, well, yeah, but resistant is not exactly what you think it means. And then obviously you'd have to, so moderators used to be paid really well, and it was a trade. It's like, you can make a ton of money, probably get PTSD, but you can make a ton of money. And then over time, they outsourced a lot of that to the Philippines. And I believe it's the Philippines because there's some cultural similarities due to geopolitical history, where, again, you don't have those cultural differences. Like, if you try to have people in Europe moderate content on Facebook for Americans, they're much more relaxed about nudity. So we freak out because we have Puritan roots, and we see a naked body and we're like, oh God, it's porn. It's like, they're just at the beach. They're nudists. No one cares. But over here, people lose their mind over that. So you got to know what country you can actually outsource to that's culturally similar enough for it to work. And then, of course, the whole reason they're outsourcing is because they want to underpay people. So now moderator pays really poorly, used to pay really well. And it is a sacrificial job. But I don't know. I think we're looking at this, like I said, the reason I talked about the speed is I think we're looking at this backwards. I think the reason we're having so much problems, besides the ad targeting stuff, is the internet. One of the missing pieces is there's no identity. There's no way to build an identity that is yours.
I was about to say, Elio, I feel like this conversation's going right into your favorite subject. And I think you're right. Like, when I look at this, if we review what we've been talking about now for an hour and a half, we've tried to find, we've explored, is an automatic method of content moderation possible? No, it's not. Is a manual method of content moderation possible? It is, but it will, basically it will harm the people who do the moderation. And so it's immoral to ask people to do that moderation for us. And so if we don't have an automatic version and we don't have a manual version that works, where does that leave us? And it seems to me that you have to prevent it from being posted in the first place. And if you can the only way I can think of to prevent it from being posted in the first place is if when you post it, your identity's attached to it. So, you post a video of violence, everyone knows it was you that posted it. Yeah. And it seems to me that this is how society has moderated itself this far. That when somebody is, how do I put it? I want to put it the right way, but like if the one person in your village, keeps on talking about this one thing that is super messed up, that person ends up getting ostracized, And I don't know if that's a good thing either, but it does seem like it's how humans have dealt with it historically.
Yeah. Now, I don't know if we want to call this a disclaimer or clarification, because I want to head off right at the pass, because as soon as you mention digital identity, people always, government ID. And there was a great write-up that I haven't been able to find again that I read talking about how the social security number, even though it used to say right on the card, not to be used for identification, number's too short, too predictable, terrible idea. But we use it for identification anyway. And because we've been so resistant to having a national ID, that's how we ended up in this terrible state of affairs. Now, what we're talking about when we talk about digital ID is not a government-issued ID. Not a government-issued ID, because that'll never fly in the U.S. What we're talking about is a self-sovereign digital identity. So what we're talking about is removing the @ When you look at an email address, it says username @ some domain that owns that ID and has control of that ID. And unless you're like me and you own your own domain and have control of your own ID, then that means you don't get to keep it. Like when you leave that company or you change providers, that's not yours anymore. They still control it. You have no access to it. So what we need is something that is an open protocol that the user creates their own identity, which in this case means creates their own cryptographic keys and has a way to safely store those. And we're not going to get into how you do recovery. What if you lose all your devices? We got a way to do that. There's technology called secret sharing schemes that you can restore your identity. Even if you lose every single device you own and all your data that you have direct control over, you could still do that without relying on a centralized server. That's a technical discussion for another show. So once you create your own identity, and you can create more than one, we can do pseudonyms. That's fine. And that's a separate argument of anonymous versus pseudonymous that I've had with people, that I think anonymous is not a good thing. Having anonymous posting is usually used for bad things. All the benefits that are usually attributed to anonymous posting can be gained and more with pseudonymous posting. And it's that unlinkability we talked about with James in the blockchain episode. As long as you have strong unlinkability, which is actually kind of hard, like if you're a whistleblower and you're posting stuff about some horrible thing, it is better to have a pseudonym so you can post again and again and again instead of just doing one drop and say, look, here's all the stuff, and gain credibility over time because the posts are verified. And you're like, oh, whoever this person is, they're not making this up. We were able to verify stuff. The same identity is that person. So it doesn't need to be anonymous. Pseudonymous is good enough as long as there's decent unlinkability. And once you can do this, though, once you can create an identity that you own and directly control, that you have sovereignty in, you can now start building long-term trust. And I really think, as you were discussing, once you can actually start investing in a digital identity, and you don't have to worry about it being yanked out from under you like we've seen these past few weeks, all these people being deplatformed, like people can deny you storage on one platform, they can deny their service, but the goodwill or ill will that you've built up on that identity can persist over time. And so you have an incentive, just like in every other society, to not be an asshole, to build a good identity that people trust and be honorable, because the more trust you have, the more honorable you've been over the longer period of time, the more valuable that identity is. And there's no shortcut to that. And so all the stuff we're seeing with phishing and bots and spamming and all this stuff, that becomes a lot harder too, because you can't just, right now, you could just create a whole bunch of extra accounts and do all kinds of nasty attacks and AstroTurf and all this other stuff. You can't do that if you have the ability and you require for certain groups. You're like, look, we got to know that you're trust. We don't even have to know exactly who you are, but just like in the real world, we're not just going to let some random person in and start pretending they're one of the group. we've got to build trust with this person and understand what their motives are. And are they trustworthy? Are they malicious? Are they, benign? Are they actually beneficial to the group? That's how trust works in the real world. And this whole idea you can build a system with no trust, this blockchain trustless BS, is absurd and toxic. And the idea that you could even do stuff, the idea you'd even want to do a trustless system, that wouldn't immediately go horribly bad, like horribly wrong, it's absurd. So I'll stop there without diving deep into the tech, but that's the gist of it.
So at first, what was going through my head was we're talking about some globally unique identifier, but then I realized, if we have a colony on Mars, then I guess it needs to be a universally unique identifier. So a UUID of some sort, and that you're talking about anybody can recreate their ID from scratch.
Right, a brand new one
whenever they want.
Won't have any trust. You'll have to start over building trust again.
Right, exactly. And what this would do would be that we can say from then on, like, for example, I want to have my kid protected from bad content being sent to them, for example, right? Well, I can say, my kid should not be receiving anything from anybody who has less than an amount of trust.
Well, okay.
An amount of credibility, for example.
But wait a minute. Let's talk about a thing we haven't brought in. So instead of just an arbitrary number that who's calculating that, what does that even mean? The only way I've ever heard of that actually works is web of trust. This is how the real world works. You meet someone and trust cures over time. The longer you know them, the more you could trust them or distrust them, depending on how they act. And then when you are introduced to other people, there is kind of a transitive property where if you introduce me to someone and be like, hey, I trust this person, so you should trust them, you should work with them. Depending on how much I trust you, I'll decide how much I actually trust that person. Intros are worth a lot, and that's how the real world works. Someone who is introduced to you by a trusted friend, you're going to have a lot more initial trust. They don't start at zero.
Gotcha.
They start positive a little bit because there's one level difference in trust. Someone introduced through someone, 2 or 3 levels deep is going to have a lower level of trust, but they're still greater than zero. And so, in your example of like, how do I protect my kid? Okay, well, obviously it's my kid. So their devices, and let's be honest, kids don't have full legal rights. The device is going to have some level of parental control. Right. So I could say, let them talk to anyone who's directly related, or maybe even 2 levels away. If this person's already in my web of trust, they can automatically just talk to my kid. This is all the family members that are trusted. I already added their teacher. We already know this is their teacher. We trust them. This is the principal. So there's this web of trust that over time expands, and intros can be done. And so you don't have to just like put some arbitrary whitelist that you're constantly managing. You can just survey and say, oh, here's the people. And the other big thing where we really screw up now with SSL and TLS for websites is we validate one chain to a root certificate. You go to the website, it gives you a cert, and then you validate, is that signed by someone who's signed by someone who's signed by like Thaughty or VeriSign or one of the root trust certificates, in which case the site must be okay, except any of those that gets compromised and the whole thing falls apart, like we saw with SolarWinds, among many examples, but the most recent. If you have web of trust where there is no single trust root, and the trust roots are people you directly know that you've interacted with and decide to give them root level trust. I trust this person. I've known them for, half my life, whatever, or I just really trust this person. They seem really good. And I'm deciding I'm giving them, this is their key. I've met them in person. We bump phones, NFC, however you want to transfer it, QR code. I know this cryptographic key corresponds to this real person that I actually trust. And then once you start seeing code, for instance, instead of just code signing coming from Apple, I don't know who Apple is. I know 1 or 2 people that work at Apple, but not well. So I don't necessarily trust code that's signed by Apple. It's this huge monolithic $1 trillion company with hiring and firing people all the time. Why would I trust the code? Right? They've already missed a whole bunch of stuff. They try to review everything and they still make mistakes, and they always will, because attackers are finding new ways to mess with stuff. So what I'd rather have is, okay, this is signed by Apple and I trust that a tiny bit. Oh, and look, DC looks like he trusts this and he uses this and he hasn't seen anything sketchy. And this other friend of mine in security who's, reverse engineering stuff, oh, he trusts this. He's like dug around and he doesn't see anything sketchy. This other security person of mine, this other computer engineer, and now we have like 5 or 10 or 20 links all pointing. And some of these people are people I actually know and I trust their expertise. And now it becomes a lot harder to slip in a nasty code update like they did with SolarWinds. And again, someone who's talking to your kid, if you could just say, look, we're just going to kind of not whitelist, but we're going to say this many levels of trust out. And people who are just beyond that trust horizon, let me take a look before I say yes. Maybe let a message or two through, but then let me verify. Yeah.
So some of the things that I'm thinking about here are, for example, there's a strong incentive now not to do something which is going to affect your trust with other people. So posting something online that is going to be highly objectionable, this is you know better than anybody, what your societal norms ought to be. This tells you, and it doesn't create some sort of universal national standard any longer. Now it's each community gets to have their own standards, and that's, again, we're talking about a solution that provides more freedom, which is kind of interesting.
Exactly.
However, I have one of the things that popped into my mind was, I've gone through some tough times in my life. And I've done some dumb things. I've posted some dumb things online. Not illegal things, nothing like that. But I've posted dumb political things online, and I've got a little overly zealous about certain ideas for maybe months at a time, and I may have. And let's take it to a better example, which is, what if somebody, for example, they go through, they have clinical depression, for example, right? Mm-hmm. And they have a really hard time controlling when they are, what they're going, the tone of the things that they're going to post online. And later on, they end up actually recovering from this. They find some therapy that works for them. They find, a program or some medication that helps them out, right? Do they have to just start over, or is there this? Is there a threat to this model, which would be that people suddenly have to create the appearance that they're perfect in order to maintain their trust with others?
I think it's a lot safer when you have actual human relationships being modeled like you do in the real world. So right now, we already have a really crap version of this. It's called a credit score. And we try to make all kinds of decisions because society, in a small village I'm kind of mixing terms here. So let's back way up. Let's talk briefly. It's disputed, but we'll go ahead and talk about Dunbar's number, which is about 150. And the research is disputed. I think it was initially done in rat models. So there's questions as to whether it actually properly transfers into humans. But anyway, Dunbar's number is the concept that if you want to know people more than just a name and act, not a deep friend, but someone that you remember the gist of when their birthday, maybe not when their birthday, but general preferences and what they do and all that kind of stuff, and have a relationship, just not a close relationship, but at least an acquaintance. You could do about 150, I think plus or minus 50 or something like that, depending on the person. And yeah.
I was just going to say, I first heard about Dunbar's number, as it was described as the monkey sphere. And so apparently Dunbar's number was arrived at actually based upon studies on monkey and primate brains, where researchers who are very, very knowledgeable in the biology of monkeys and apes are able to actually just hold a brain in their hand and tell you approximately how large the Dunbar's number for that particular species is. And that when you hold the human brain in your hand, if you give a human brain to them, they predicted it was about 150. And it's through experimentation, we found that our ape brains, the size of our brain is actually correlated with what that number ends up being.
Interesting. You've researched this more than I have. So
It's
I
a, just called
I'm
the
just
monkey sphere. So check it out. It's
yeah,
pretty interesting.
I'm just thinking we're going to ignore how we got to the scenario of me handing a researcher a human brain. That's a whole other thing. So
Yeah.
but the idea is that in small villages, yeah, you could basically know everyone, and people grew up together, and they tended not to move around a whole lot, or when they did, it was kind of permanent. They would stay there. And so you would know who is trustworthy, who is reliable, who is, kind of the town scoundrel, like the one you can't trust. Oh, yeah, no, I'll pay you back next week, and never does, and all that. And so there was no need for a credit score, because when you asked someone for something, you had a reputation. They knew exactly what they were dealing with, and they just be like, yeah, or no, absolutely not. And then as you start going to societies where you have thousands and tens and hundreds of thousands and millions of people living in a city together, you're just so far beyond that number, you can't know everyone. There's not enough time to meet a million people and actually get to know them, barely in a lifetime. So you have to have some proxy. And when you're, for instance, a bank trying to decide, will we get our money back? Which that's what they care about. If that's your business, is lending money and trying to make more and get it back, like that's what you care about. And similar with insurance. So we came up with a credit score, and a credit score is only supposed to assess how likely are you to pay back the money that people lend you. And the problem is, because we don't have any other way to measure trust, and society is too big to go off word of mouth, well, we kind of, like the Social Security number, we accidentally end up using the credit score as a proxy for all kinds of things. And if you want to go get a government clearance, one of the things that will disqualify you right off the bat for any level of security clearance, if you have a low credit score, that's just a proxy. And that does kind of make sense. It's like, well, hey, if you're in financial trouble, which if you have a low credit score, probably bad about paying it back, you probably owe some money. And they don't want a foreign nation being like, hey, if you hand us, get that data for us, and we'll drop a few million in an offshore account, right? So that makes sense. But the problem is the credit score has now become a proxy for anything and everything.
Right.
And how really, available, like how quickly you pay back loans does not correlate to like, how good are you with kids? If I'm going to have you watch my kids or something, just because you don't pay back your loans on time doesn't mean you're a bad person. It means maybe you suck with money, but you could be phenomenal. And just because you're really good about paying back loans does not mean you are trustworthy around children. So there's no correlation there.
Also, in just the tech industry, sometimes your credit score is used in case you are going to be working around sensitive information, for example. And they tend to, sometimes they will run a credit check on you to see whether or not you are trustworthy to be around this sensitive information. And again, it's two different kinds of metrics.
And it makes sense for like a blackmailability perspective, but that's only one of the threats in a proper threat model. What if this person is ideological, like just ideologically they're against what you're doing, and they're like, oh, I'm going to go take a job and be an insider and work my way up and then screw them over, right? It doesn't have any bearing on that, or any other of a number of things you might want to know. So we're lacking. Society has grown to these massive multi-million people cities, but we do not have the tools to actually deal with trust at this scale. And this is a major problem because now we need to. And this is where you see phishing and all the malware stuff, spear phishing, spam calls, all the warranty. I'm sure you're getting, your car's extended warranty. Yeah, no, I'm good. Thanks. It's not a thing. I'm not sending you money. Right. And it would be great if you could just tell your phone, hey, look, if I don't know these people and they're not connected to anything, anyone, or any business I'm already working with, just drop the call, just throw it away straight to dev null. And there's no way to do that because we don't have a system to actually track trust. Our devices are completely blind, and almost every connection coming in has the same level, or in most cases, complete lack of trust. And it's really bad. And it's starting to really hurt us. Again, SolarWinds, current example that's really good, but only one of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of examples where, because we don't have any way to actually deal with real trust in a digital sense, this missing piece of the internet is just killing us. And we've got it. We can't work around it. We need it.
So what I find interesting about this is, first off, it sounds like this could work. But then it would also create a very strong economic incentive for criminals to steal your private key and impersonate you, because then they can gain access to all kinds of things. And it would be fairly difficult, I would imagine, for you to, unless maybe you could report your identity as having been stolen. But at that point, how if your identity gets stolen, for example, then doesn't that force you to have to restart your life?
But here's where I think that's a smaller problem, where right now what we have is a much bigger problem. So right now, your identity isn't yours. A little bit of your identity is Google's and Facebook's, and then the government has some pieces of it, and it's scattered in literally thousands of pieces for some people. And the problem is none of those is properly protected. You could just, even if there's two-factor authentication, one of the ways is people just bypass the two-factor. And they'll just use an SS7 attack to go ahead and reroute your text message for literally a few seconds, get that two-factor token if you're not using an app, and then they'll log in as you. And so because you're not in control of your identity, you don't have any way of strengthening that really actually works. And if these other companies aren't taking proper care, which, man, if you haven't been watching the breaches for the last 10 years, they are not taking proper care of their services. Look at Parler in the title here. Really piss poor security. They did a terrible job architecting their system, and they had third-party providers. They had no defense in depth. And when those providers decided to yank access and not provide their services, they had no ability to prevent anyone from just doing a password recovery as an admin. And it really was problematic for them. So my argument is that it's much easier in today's world to do these type of attacks on these poorly protected systems and grab someone's identity. Whereas if you actually had a system where you had a TCB, a trusted computing base, and for our purposes, I'm looking around to see if I have anything that can serve as a stand-in. Not really. I have a cord here. That'll work, I guess. But they have little YubiKeys and some other little devices that are like little size of a little thumb drive. And that little device, instead of running some big bloated OS that needs to be constantly updated, can be much more carefully built. The hardware can be validated. The software can be validated because all it's doing is managing some crypto keys. And a lot of these little devices can actually create keys on device, and those keys can actually stay in a secure tamper-proof enclave that never leaves the device. And then via plugging it in or NFC, you can now have this device where physical possession of this device is your root key. And then you can have a whole key hierarchy where, if someone wants to impersonate you, it's not really possible because they'd actually have to go after this physical device, or they'd have to go after one. If they went after a lower level key in the tree, then you just invalidate that key and you just make a new one and there's no issue and your identity is still yours. And to go after the root key, they would actually have to break into your house, which is doable.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. It is doable.
The problem right now, we're seeing rampant identity theft, not because people from India are breaking into your house. They're breaking into your computer because it's a piece of junk and it has no way of protecting you. Or they're not even breaking into your computer. They're breaking into a company's computer and you end up with identity theft. So you're taking the economics of the attack and you're taking it from something that's automatable and purely online, and you're now turning it into a physical attack, which is far, far, far more costly and totally infeasible at the scale they're doing it now.
Sure, but the actual repercussions of this, currently, if I have my identity stolen online, I might lose some money. I might have to do some cleanup, for example. But if somebody gets into my house and steals my root key in this new system you're talking about, my life is absolutely ruined. And I have to start entirely over from scratch.
The wonderful thing about a web of trust, rather than today's single line chain of trust, is that you can immediately, the people you know and interact with day to day, you can immediately generate a new key and be like, hey, revoke the old one. Tell everyone we mutually know that key has been compromised. It's not me anymore. And here's the new one. And now maintaining, in today's model, you only need to break one link in the chain to impersonate a site.
Interesting.
And gain trust. In a web of trust, you would have to, at a minimum, compromise at least half, if not more than half of the nodes. And even if you did compromise, if people are getting conflicting, like, wait a minute, this key is this is DC. No, this is DC. I'm probably going to be like, hey, man, like, let's get together. Let's validate on a secure channel which one of these is actually you. And then I'll be one more node that's actually vouching for the right key. So maintaining a compromised identity becomes extremely difficult, damn near impossible for someone who's got a well-connected graph. And recovering from a compromise becomes a lot faster and easier. You're not sitting on the phone with some big corporation doesn't give a damn about you, praying that they'll give you your account back. You're just like, hey, dude, key was compromised. Here's the new one. You're like, all right, gotcha. I'll put it out.
Gotcha. So there is a technical solution that makes that allows you to preserve your identity, invalidates the old access key or whatever it is, and then you issue a new one out to your friends. And
just to throw it in there, the other thing you can do, again, self-sovereign. It's under your control. So instead of this one size fits all, everyone's stuck with the same level of security, which kind of sucks, and it's not yours. You have nothing you can really do about it. Now you could take whatever precautions you want. And so if you're a kid and you're not legally, autonomous yet because you're too young, well, your parents are storing that key. They have your root key, right? Because they still kind of have control of you. That's how that goes. If you're your own adult and you don't really have any major threats, you could just store it on a little YubiKey or something. If you have a higher threat profile and there is a risk that someone will try to actually infiltrate a physical location and steal your key, there's this cool technology that we kind of brushed over earlier called the secret sharing scheme. And you can actually split the root key into multiple fragments, and you can choose what N and M are. And you could say, out of M fragments, which could be 50 or 100 or whatever number you want, this many are needed, 20, 30, 40, whatever the number is. And if you pull all these together, you can reconstitute the root key, but you have to have that minimum has to be exactly that number or you got nothing. And this technology has been around for decades. The most famous one is Shamir's secret sharing scheme. And there's a new version of it that's got some other cool stuff that I was just reading about last night. So yeah, you can actually not have any location. And that network of all the people you trust the most can each hold one of these shares. And now either 20 people have to collude against you to steal your identity, these are all people you know and trust. Like if the 20 closest people to you are willing to collude, you got bigger problems. Or an adversary has to go attack 20 different. First of all, they have to know which 20 they are. You don't have to share that with any central authority. They don't even know who to actually attack. And secondly, again, they're going to have to go after 20 different targets and succeed without being detected 20 times. So we're changing the economics of an identity theft attack from this like trivial thing of just attack these companies, just go call and pretend that you're the person and do a password reset and done. And now I have your identity, to breaking into your house, cracking 20 different computers of people you know and somehow not being detected, and then somehow maintaining that. Once I notice something's fishy, maintaining that key, trying to get these people not to issue key revocation messages to everyone else. Like the economics shift where it becomes very, very, very difficult to maintain a compromise. First of all, to pull it off, and secondly, to maintain it in a way that is very favorable to people who are on the right side of things. Because right now, the economics of attack are very favorable to the attacker, which is why it's happening all the time. Because it works. Right. It's easy. It's cheap.
Okay, so I'm convinced. I'm convinced that strong digital identity is sort of the best solution that has been discussed so far. It may be the best solution that there is. I'm convinced that it possibly might be. However, the next big can of worms here, which our viewer Angry Knees has
he's always
touched
got
on
good questions.
He's
what
touched
you got,
on
Angry
one,
Knees?
he's touched on one big question here, which I'm going to suggest we do not actually answer tonight.
Okay.
But rather let's do a part 3. A funeral parlor part 3, in which we talk about adoption of this system, because I have some strong reservations as to whether or not society and the world and the powers that be would want this kind of a system, or allow it to be adopted. And Angry Knee says he guesses that one of the difficulties would be figuring out how to make this key management system simple enough that his fisherman grandfather would bother with it in the first place. So we're not going to answer that tonight, but that's a great question.
I'll give a teaser because, as usual, he's not wrong. Good question, and a very important question because, no matter... So the tech to do this, PGP, pretty good privacy, that Phil Zimmerman invented back in the 80s. Yeah, the crypto, all that stuff, well, crypto might need a slight refresh to be post-quantum these days, but that's honestly not that hard. But the tech to have really, truly sovereign identity, that you create your own key hierarchy and you manage it and you send emails that no one can break. That's why the NSA wanted Zimmerman in prison forever, because they're like, do you know how much harder you made our jobs? Now everyone has military grade encryption. Like, we want you put away forever. We don't want to have to work that hard. And he narrowly escaped and didn't go to jail. And PGP is now championed by a lot of people. But yeah, Angry Dees is right. It's not widely used, even though it's since the 80s. It's like, not quite a half century it's been around. It's about 40 years now. And it's too hard. Even programmers like you and me, it's such a pain to set up. It's so painful. The ergonomics just aren't there. So anything that's going to actually get adopted has to have a good UI. He's right about that. The other thing, too, that I want to touch on, if anyone wants to do some reading before the episode, we'll recover this. There is a concept that I think a lot of people confuse. Identities have two purposes, and people mush this together. And you have discovery of, I want to find a person I haven't contacted yet. And this is where pet names come in, which is the actual technical term from the Rebooting the Web of Trust working group. And Zuko's triangle. Then there's routability. And so Zuko's triangle is kind of like cap theorem for identity. I'm not going to explain it. We'll leave it as a teaser. But you need, for discoverability, you need human memorizable, catchy names. For routability, it needs to be secure and distributed. But if you split those two functions, everyone tries to just cram it together and pretend that discoverability and routability, you need the same name. You don't actually need the same name. Pet names is how we solve that. We're stopping there. We'll cover how that actually works and what all that means next time we talk about this.
Sounds good. So on this next episode, I think just a quick overview of the topic. I think let's cover off on how do we make a system like this simple for individuals to adopt it, but also let's talk through a lot of the problems that you and I have talked about in the past on how do we get the world at large to adopt this, especially when there are so many incentives for the powers that be to sabotage the adoption of something like this. And so this way they can maintain centralized control over things like identity and stuff like that. Let's not get into it right now. I'm going to end this on almost exactly 2 hours. And I think that was a great...
We'll leave with one positive thing that, again, we'll go into next time. There's a lot of work, not enough, but there is quite a bit of work in this space being done. There's some good stuff. There are smart people working on the technologies and how would this all work. So again, next time we'll get into the details, but people have been working on this for decades and it's looking pretty good right now.
Yeah. And I like how this is turning into sort of a trilogy because, the first part was really just ranting about the problem and me knee-jerking against that problem. The second one was more carefully discussing that problem and arriving at what seems to be the only real plausible solution to this. And then we'll end that on how do we even discuss, all of the factors that go into the adoption of that solution. So everybody out there who has been with us thus far in this journey of discussing content moderation, deplatforming, starting with Parler being taken down. I appreciate you all sticking in there with me and with Elio, and we will continue this next time. Definitely tune in tomorrow. We have 2 guest shows tomorrow. So
Tomorrow is Friday. That's Saturday.
Sorry,
right?
not tomorrow. Sorry. Saturday, we have 2 guest shows. So definitely check us out on Saturday. We're going to have one show going live at about 12:30, and we're going to have another show going live at 2:30. So 2 different guests, 2 different topics. It's going to be great. See you all then. Have a good night.